Well, the answer to that question, Robert, is if you look at the schedule for the various philosophy groups, there's a literature group that meets and discusses literature. There's a movies group that meets and discusses movies. So I thought, well, if we're discussing literature, fiction, and if we're discussing movies, well, then why shouldn't there be a group that discusses comics? Why not? There's nothing wrong with comics as a form of fiction, literary pursuit. So let's have a group that discusses the art and literature of comics and do so from a philosophical standpoint. So
That
that's what
that
this
may
group is. We're here every
okay.
Friday night at this time to come and talk about the art and literature of comics.
How long has it been going on?
About 5.5 years.
Oh, okay. No, I must have noticed it at some point. If you're on the Seattle philosophy meetup page, but I can't say that I recall. I must have. It just didn't register. It was
We're
the
we're here every Friday night at this time. We come here to talk about comics. We choose a comic, we read it in advance. We come here and talk about the comic.
okay. I didn't meet my requirement. Then I didn't read the comic.
Okay.
I read the page that you posted. So yeah, but I hadn't. It was certainly more the character in question that brought me to this particular meetup than the fact that it was about comic books.
Okay.
Conan the Barbarian.
Conan the
Exactly.
Barbarian. Cool.
Well, I remember being in a dopey science fiction club above a seedy comic book shop back in the 80s, the good old days. Well, early 80s, that was still living in the 70s until everything became very commercial. And there were a few bods up there discussing, the Conan books, and they seemed to really enjoy them. I never got into Conan, and I just wondered what was going on there. And I found that I did actually enjoy these Conan comics.
You did?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you get into the swing of things. I think the power is, of course, that Conan is vulnerable. He might be good with the sword, but he gets taken by every glamorous female he comes across. So he's got weaknesses, and that's what makes him interesting.
Are you referring specifically to his vulnerability to women?
Yes, he has a type of weakness. He's not. His power seems to be in physical combat. He's fairly unstoppable in that regard, but he can succumb to the wiles of the civilized world. You see that there's a certain cunning in the civilized world, and so he's a rustic from outside of that world. And I mean, I don't know. It seems he's fights a wizard, robs a temple, goes to the local bar in a loincloth, which is not segregated. It seems women in flimsy clothing are allowed into these bars. And he gets usually done over by a female, and then usually, he ends up all of his only possessions are his loincloth by the end of the story. So that's the comic. I don't know. Are you a fan of the books, Robert?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I grew up on them. Now, I did discover the character through the comics. I'm not quite old enough to have been there in the Roy Thomas era. I did read a bunch of those eventually in reprints, but it was more like the early 80s when I discovered the character. And then through the comics, I eventually found my way to the various pastiches, including the original Robert Howard stories. And then by the time my teens were over, I had become a purist, a snob. I looked down on all the various continuations of the character that were not by the original author. And then I sort of gravitated away from it and moved on to other things. But I was pulled back into my interest in Robert E. Howard, and I've been periodically pulled back into my interest in Robert E. Howard's work as I studied history and even philosophy, and frequently found myself reminded of things I had read in Howard's work. He incorporated so much history in his stories, not just his Conan stories, but the actual historical stories he wrote, some of which were quite similar in their tenor and structure to the Conan stories. All kinds of history I never learned in school. I consider Howard to have been, in retrospect, one of my professors, because he definitely introduced me to a whole.
Oh yeah, the Grey God Passes, which is
which?
based on the Grey God Passes, is one of the Howard.
That was one, yeah. Yeah, I remember that one.
Based on that battle in Ireland. When was it? About 1015, 1017.
Yeah, I don't remember.
The Vikings and the Irish.
Mm-hmm. He wrote a number of stories in the Viking ethos. He wrote a number in the Crusades. He wrote pirate stories. He wrote the Solomon Kane stories, which take place in Elizabethan era England. So I learned a lot of history without realizing it, reading Robert E. Howard, or at least I was acquainted with it. Obviously, he wasn't restricted to historical accuracy, but he put enough of it in there that it intrigued me. And then I recognized it when I encountered it in actual history. I realized I had been there already. I had been acquainted with some of the things I was reading about. I just didn't know they were real until many years later. So
okay, I like the Grey God Passes. I have there was another story, I forget the name of it, and there's a guy who's a cripple. He lives in Texas, and he meets his daughter,
Valley of the Worm.
Priestess woman. Sorry, what was the name of it?
Valley of the Worm.
Okay, and he sort of had some past life when he was a great warrior or something like that.
Right.
When there was some massive, like an Atlantean destruction or something like that.
Yeah, the character he wrote. I think he wrote two stories of that character, and the premise of the stories is he can remember his past lives. He's a sickly man in modern times who's dying, but he has the ability to remember his heroic past existences, and again, they're pretty great, actually. I think in their concept. I think they're very much a self-commentary on his part. I think he identified with that character, and that his own imagination was so vivid that it must have seemed that he was reliving past lives.
That's a little bit Jack London. He was sort of on a bit about past lives as well.
Yeah.
So it was sort of the influence of the Theosophical Society at the time, I suppose.
Yeah, Madame Blavatsky. Yeah. So London, as I understand it, was his favorite writer. And so the influence there was pretty obvious.
I have to give that London was a better writer. I'm sorry.
But that's fine. Howard was only 30 when he died. Although I suppose London was pretty young too.
I don't think he was excessively old. He overdosed on painkillers when he had a kidney stone or something. That was a story, wasn't it, in World War One?
Yeah, that sounds approximately right.
Well, it's an interesting era of writers, and then you've got Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was the cynic. He thought, these guys are writing this stuff. I can write this stuff.
Sure.
Fool the public. Because also, of course, this was still a time when people went to grammar school. They were taught their grammar with the aid of a rod, and it works marvels.
Yeah, would you bring that back?
Oh, of course, I'm a barbarian.
Yeah, I'm concerned we're entering the era of not even being able to write anymore, with offloading that to artificial intelligence. But yeah, he definitely, in a lot of ways, Howard would have been the product of a 19th century education. I mean, his teachers would have been born in the 19th century. It was still lingering. He was born in 1906, as I recall. So it was still very much.
Spare the cane and spoil the child.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I didn't think I would enjoy the Conan comics, but I was surprised. I actually did enjoy them. An interesting complaint that was being made to the illustrative style is the Conan in the comic is not really that much more built than Charles Atlas, and people much preferred the was it Frank Frazetta sort of style illustrations where it's just this mountain of beefcake.
Right.
Which of course is ridiculous because the Conan in the story was athletic. He wasn't just a piece of beefcake. He actually had to move.
Right. Right. I don't think Howard, in his conception, was confined by realism, so he could be the biggest and the strongest and the quickest all at the same time. There was no constraint like that. But I think maybe Winsor's art is more consistent with somebody who would be capable of moving swiftly than say Frazetta's conception. Although I think Frazetta nevertheless created the greatest images of the character. Certainly the most iconic images inspired by Howard's art were by Frank Frazetta, at least in my opinion.
Well, the actual simians were in the era of Herodotus. He actually writes about the simians too and their fate.
The Sumerians?
Yeah, sorry, maybe I'm mispronouncing it. But,
yeah, Sumerians.
And well, they ruled Ukraine and they got wiped out by the Scythians.
Right.
But a group of them broke away and invaded Anatolia. And of course, on some level, the background adventure in a certain sort of sense would have actually existed. This, even though it's supposedly 10,000 BC, this is actually the sort of stuff that was going on in that era.
Sure.
I mean, this was an era that was not quite constrained by, this is where the philosophy comes in, it's not constrained by the budding rationalism that still dominates our culture. We're constrained by rational ideas, but prior, well, this was the Sumerians lived in the beginning of the Axial Age. And they just didn't quite have the level of rationalistic concept which became expressed with, say, Socrates or the Greeks. Sure. That was a new invention.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you were to take the time frame of the stories literally, they took place long before recorded history. You know, there's no records going back 10,000 years as far as I know. Although that might put it on par with Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, which I believe is the oldest archaeological monument of any size And that might be roughly contemporaneous with when the original Conan stories are supposed to be set. But they're full of anachronisms. I mean, they have iron, for example. They didn't have that. I don't think they even had bronze back then, or maybe not even copper. So that might have still been the Stone Age, technically.
Yeah, copper appeared around 4,500 BC.
Yeah.
Bronze, a little bit before 3,000 BC. It spread.
Mm-hmm.
And ironworking was actually a bit complicated because it took them about 1,000 years to learn how to make good iron.
Mm-hmm.
Iron was originally a cheap substitute for bronze.
Right. In any event, all of those antedate the time the Conan stories are supposed to be set. So they're certainly not true to history in that regard, because Howard puts iron and steel and bronze in his stories, even though they would have taken place 10,
Well, there
12
is
years.
that theoretician, I can't remember his name. He's very heavily disliked by the academics. He keeps
Uh-huh.
on claiming there's some lost civilization
Sure.
from about 10,000 BC, and
You're referring to Graham Hancock.
that's probably right. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a mystery, What was there? Well, I don't expect the towering cities of Conan, but was there some sort of culture
Sure.
back then that we don't quite understand?
Yeah. It's a tantalizing possibility. I think that I'm in love with that idea. I don't know if it's true, but I think such ideas were implanted in my head by reading those stories when I was a kid. They definitely got me thinking about how old civilization might be, and what kind of character it may have had if it existed longer than conventional history allows.
It's Cismatalia. Yeah, well, she studied art, and I keep on telling her to go back and start working on her comics again, but she doesn't.
I've done a fair amount of talking. I could talk about this subject all night, but I don't want to hog up the conversation. So I don't know. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
That's okay. I wasn't familiar with Conan, so I just thought the comic would be a lever for me to get into some of the concepts.
Sure.
Because I thought, yeah, I didn't know whether I'd enjoy the original stories, but I might be a bit curious about that now.
It's hard to say how I would have reacted to them if I had discovered them in my adulthood. I was only in middle school when I read the original Howard stories and the various pastiches by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter and Robert Jordan and others. Very difficult to say how I would have reacted to the character when I was 30, say, if I discovered him at that point. I'll always see them through the lenses of nostalgia.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This is where, he's carrying some woman over his shoulders at the end of the comic who turns out to be a demon, which is rather close to reality, actually, isn't it?
How so? Like symbolically?
So, yes, metaphorically. Like, you know, he'll trust some woman with
Uh,
his gold and she disappears.
I see.
And then she reappears in a later comic and he forgives her.
I would recommend, if you want to try the original stories, two come to mind that are quite short, that are good introductions. One is called The Frost Giant's Daughter, and that's very much on the theme that you just talked about. And the other is called Tower of the Elephant, which is considered one of the best of the original stories. It might have been the first one published as well.
Yeah, that was the second or third comic in the series based on
Okay,
Tower
yeah,
of
it
the
may have been
Elephant.
adapted pretty early, but yeah, those are the ones I would reread. I think if I was inclined to reread those Conan stories. I did reread one last year, or maybe it was this year. That was more of a novella called "A Witch Shall Be Born," and it's not one of the better stories, but it has a very famous scene in it that has kind of taken on its own life. It was adapted into the Schwarzenegger movie quite unconvincingly, but it deals with Conan being crucified like Jesus.
Oh, yeah, yeah, there was mention of that somewhere in the comics, but it wasn't actually. I think in the commentary at the end of an issue,
Yeah.
they mentioned that. So you were familiar with Conan before the movie, or?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Not much before, because like, the movie came out in the like '82 or '83, so I was about 12 at that point. But I would have known the character well before then. In fact, I wasn't allowed to see the movie because it was rated R. I didn't see it until years later. Um, but it borrows the crucifixion scene out of context, puts it in a different context, and it doesn't do justice to it. I enjoy the movie for what it is. I mean, it's a kind of a brilliant movie in its way, but not every scene in it works, in my opinion.
It was heavily criticised at the time.
I'm sure. Yeah, I. Nevertheless, it's sort of a classic. I mean, people quote it, people still watch it.
There was Conan the Destroyer, which fitted more in with the artistic concept of the barbarian sort of sword and sorcery film.
I wouldn't say that it was any truer to the spirit of the originals. I mean, maybe it was truer to the spirit of the comics, but those, that's I would say that. Well, actually, I wouldn't say either of them was particularly faithful to the.
That was a criticism I heard. A lot of people didn't like the first movie, but thought the second movie reflected the sword and sorcery concepts better.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree, but that's.
That was their opinion. I thought the first movie, the director was trying to make something more epic.
Mhm.
Uh,
Sure. Yeah.
there
I
was
agree
a
with that.
few rather successful films at the time on that sort of sword and sorcery theme, wasn't it? It came out in the mid 80s, and actually we haven't seen films as good as the ones that were made back then.
No, that genre is not nearly as popular now. Um, they had tried to revive it as a movie concept with Jason Momoa as Conan in the early 2010s. Wasn't very successful, um, either artistically or in the box office.
There was a remake of Conan I recall watching. I thought it was awful.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably the one I just referred to.
Actually, I'm just trying to think now. I think there were two movies I went and saw repeatedly. And yeah, it was the first Conan the Barbarian. I think I went and watched it about 7 times.
Wow.
And Empire Strikes Back.
Uh,
But it's something I couldn't do today. But when I was a kid back in my early 20s, that was something I could do back then. Yeah, I remember. When I went and saw first time, you have the shot of Schwarzenegger pushing around the big wheel,
Mhm.
and the girl screams out, "Oh, he's beautiful!" And some guy says, "What a spunk!" The guy said, "You're a poofter." The guy said, "No, you're just jealous."
Yeah, that's when he was at the height of his fame as a bodybuilder, and that movie was his transition point from bodybuilding to acting to eventually being the governor of California, which is interesting if you think about it, because the character's career goes from being an obscure barbarian to being a king. So Schwarzenegger's career paralleled the characters pretty neatly.
Ah, wearing the crown of California on a troubled
Exactly.
brow.
California and Aquilonia.
Did he achieve any good?
I don't know. I don't follow state politics particularly. I gather he was considered to be an effective governor. I don't know. I really don't know the state that well. But the fact that he rose to the governorship of California, I mean, who would have predicted that?
Yeah, well, if I base Conan and the Cimmerians in the at the beginning of the Axial Age,
Mhm.
this was a period of experimental culture. That they were trying out stuff that was new, that was sort of like for the first time, which some elements of culture died out, others survived, like the invention of money. As about 600 BC, so it sort of corresponds with this era. There was a new thing, and it changed the way people acted and how they would think. So what I've learned in lectures anyway, that like for example, you had the Assyrians
Mhm.
who created the machinery of empire. Prior to the Assyrians, well, when the Assyrians created the first large empire, which, for example, they would conquer a territory and control it with governors. Whereas prior to that, you attacked the other guy, beat his army, uh, told him to pay tribute to you, and you went home. But the Assyrians laid the basis for the empire that was copied by everybody else after them, like the Persians, the Romans, and the Greeks.
So you mentioned the invention of money around that time. Do you know where that comes from and how that relates to the beginnings of empire?
Oh well, yeah. Lydia famously began because they had a source of the particular metal was electrum, was a mixture of silver and gold. And the king of Lydia would stamp out coins with sort of like a guaranteed purity. And it became the craze. Suddenly people became money conscious. It wasn't the same sort, it didn't work the same way with the way they would trade stuff before then. They certainly had gold and silver, but they would use uh, other goods as money, like grain. Grain was used as
Mhm.
money, or
Sure.
anything which would sort of last. But precious metal is such an abstraction compared to the other goods.
Right.
You go, look, I'm rich. I've got all these, bits of metal here, and somebody would go, but can you eat it? Of course, you
Uh-huh.
could trade it in normal times, but of course, you didn't have. You had an abstract form of wealth.
Right. that the abstraction of it is what interests me. It doesn't seem like an obvious idea that somebody would have come up with. It seems like it might have had or must have had a more organic development than that. But then I wonder whether once the idea of abstract value becomes commonplace, what effect that has on thinking at that point. How does that affect the trajectory of human thought? And what are
Well,
the
it sort of created the basis for a more intense trading system that
Mhm.
you've got these bits of metal and they're all these coins, and they're guaranteed to have a certain weight of precious metal in them and a degree of purity. Whereas before that, if they were dealing in precious metal, they were just weighing out. They had to weigh it out, and then they had to wonder about the purity, and they were never sure of it. But that, it just made it look like you don't have to, wonder about the uncertainties so much anymore, or bother with weighing the stuff. You just go bang.
Right.
There's the money, dude.
It's streamlined and facilitated the process of trade.
Well, in this era was, in a certain sense, the invention of international trade.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to the Phoenicians, international trade was restricted. There's literally the story of Abraham in the Bible. If he goes into Egypt, he has to meet the Pharaoh or some official under the Pharaoh, and what stuff have you got, Abraham? What can you give us? Okay, I'll take that stuff. And so the source of distribution for foreign goods was through the Pharaoh's office. But with the Phoenicians, you're starting to get secular trade, public trade that was a little bit outside the office of the king or something like that, because that would always be a restriction on the amount of international trade you could do. The king might say, "No, I don't want your stuff," and send you packing. But if anybody wanted some lovely goods that, maybe like, some precious stones, let's say, which don't occur in Egypt, they're going to come via the Pharaoh and his officers. And that was created a greater power for the crown that in this era they're starting to invent trade markets.
Yeah, well, again, that's a anachronism in the Conan stories, because they certainly have money in the Conan stories. That certainly exists.
Yes, gems and precious metals in prolific amounts. Actually, if you look at the amount of, they use the concept of above ground gold. If you went back to those eras, the amount of above ground golds would have been probably no more than a few hundred tons over the entire world.
Mm.
Whereas now we've gotten over 200,000 tons.
I presume because we can dig deeper and extract it.
Yeah, well, machinery, chemistry. Well, this is one of the things that limited the Roman Empire. I studied the Roman Empire a bit. And of course, famously, Gibbons puts it down to what he termed a moral decline. And part of the moral decline was becoming Christian, as far as Gibbons was concerned, which is pretty much a stab against the church in the 18th century. But when I was checking, I think a lot of it was their access to commodities started to run out. Like when they'd taken over Spain, Spain had been a bonanza. Like they said, I think, when they've done those sort of ice cores and that, and, looked at the signature of the metals, that at one point, 3/4 of the world's silver was being mined in Spain.
Hmm.
And this was one of the powers of the Roman Empire, that they had this stuff that they could trade with the East
Sure.
for, spices and stuff like that. You used to have the Egyptian treasure fleet, which used to sail to India. So silver would have been one of the great components traded with the Orient for whatever the Orient had. But the silver and gold ran out, and also other metals like iron had been fairly common in the earlier days, and was starting to become accessible. Iron was starting to become scarce, so all the metals, copper, so forth, were becoming less common at the end of the empire, and partly that's what brought the empire down. The interesting one is iron, because Europe is not the world's greatest piece of agricultural real estate. Before the existence of iron, it was a world of barbarians. And it was iron tools that enabled them to really produce a good surplus from the European landscape. Whereas there's places in China and India which are that rich with water and fertile soil, that you don't need the greatest tools in the world to get a good surplus. But Europe went downhill when the iron became scarce.
And when would that have been, by your understanding?
Well, I think one of the proxies they have is, oceanic trade in the Mediterranean, that it went into a steep decline after about 200 AD.
Okay.
It seems the material height of the Greco-Roman culture was around about the time of Jesus. But it was pretty strong, and then, there's a rapid decline. The silver was starting to become scarce in the 3rd century, and was a 3rd century collapse. But then they evolved a new system which enabled the empire, or the Western Empire, to survive a bit longer. Because the Western Empire, without these available commodities, couldn't really pay for itself. Like, for example, the province of Egypt was produced 10 times the taxes of the province of Gaul. Gaul was almost worthless to the Roman tax base compared with something like Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that some historians think that Caesar's conquest of Gaul was really more of a weight on the future Rome than anything else. Maybe they should have just stuck with southern Gaul and kept out of the northern part, which was the only stuff of value. There was a few goods, but basically it was only good for slaves, and maybe a little bit of agriculture. Occasionally, they found deposits of stuff they were looking for, like they went to Britain, and the valuable stuff was, the stuff like tin, and that eventually ran out. So Gaul and Britain were ultimately net losses to the empire, a bit like the Philippines was to the Spanish Empire.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I understand that Britain enters the historical record as a source of tin, that would have been where it started to be recorded. Its existence started to become recorded, and that even predates the Roman Empire. There was a point I was going to make. Yeah, have you read or heard of an essay by Robert E. Howard called "The Hyborian Age"?
No, I haven't.
I,
I think
I would look.
I'd recall it.
I would look into that. It's an essay that he wrote as sort of a background synopsis of his the imaginary epoch of history that his stories are set in, and he develops the history over several thousand years with a fair amount of precision. And it's complete fantasy, but it's fascinating um, in what it reveals about his understanding of the historical process and the rise and fall of empires. And he just sort of projected that understanding back into an imaginary prehistory. I suspect you'd find it quite interesting based on what you've been talking about.
Oh, I might give it a go. Well, anyway, yeah, I've noted it down. Of course, it's a little bit the story of Sir Percival in the Arthurian tales, where a relatively unsophisticated warrior strikes civilization,
Mhm.
and it creates a sort of a clash. Uh, you see an element of that in the movie Zardoz, if you've ever seen that one.
Which one?
A movie called Zardoz. It's by the guy that did Deliverance, John Borman,
Oh,
and
okay.
it's a science fiction story about
Mhm.
a future where the world collapses
Mhm.
and the last of the sophisticates uh, seal themselves off in what they call these vortexes, which are surrounded by a force field, and the rest of the world turns back to barbarism.
Okay.
And it features they got Sean Connery, who used to be a Mr. Universe in his younger days, in a red loincloth and hooker boots, riding on horseback.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I'll dig out. There's a bit on YouTube. I actually went and saw the movie again about 5, 6 years ago with a new print, and I was surprised how much I enjoyed the film.
Hmm.
Uh,
I'll see if it's on YouTube.
yeah, well, it's just sort of a Goethean theory that, a civilization becomes decadent and the barbarians invade, and the barbarians give the culture fresh blood, so to speak, that
Sure.
returns the drive in the culture, or creates a new, well, it's a bit like the Franks invading Rome and Gaul, and they begin a culture which lasts for quite a long time.
Yeah, that's a constant theme. And actually, it's the theme in history, as I understand it. There's a cyclical pattern to civilizations where they almost become, it's like they become victims of their own success. They become stagnant and complacent, and then are overrun by barbarians who institute themselves as the new ruling class. And then they, over time, will eventually become stagnant and decadent themselves to be overrun by a new wave of barbarians. And Howard certainly plays up that element in his stories. He was very
Uh,
conscious of that idea.
You're in this Zardoz, the Eternals, and they're immortal, who are living in these vortexes, create a cult, the cult of Zardoz. And you've got sort of like this levitating stone head. It comes down amongst the barbarians, encouraging them to wipe the other barbarians out, because they were trying to control the world. So this stone head would come down and they'd pour forth guns which they had collected, the Eternals. And they'll give the guns to the barbarians, and the barbarians like the guns. And so I've put a link for that little scene in the chat.
Thank you. I'll look that up. That sounds fun.
Yeah, I could actually put it on screen, I think. Rightio.